listeners to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. So if you missed last week's episode, or you have been living under a rock for the past week, or probably even longer than that, you might be unaware that there was a little event that went on out in Cupertino, California this past week at Apple Park. Apple, of course, the multi-trillion-dollar tech company, held their annual September event, aka the iPhone event, this week, and we are going to be getting into all the good stuff, or not good stuff, depending on how you want to look at it, what angle you want to take, but we're going to get into it. So this is going to be a little bit of a deviation from our normal episode. We're mainly going to focus on the event itself. We'll have some trivia, but the cybersecurity tip and the nerdy things we are going to axe this week just for the sake of time. Now, you will want to tune in next week because there's going to be a double heaping of nerdy things, and boy, oh boy, there was a lot of stuff that went on this week. A lot of infrastructure upgrades and things breaking, just as a little bit of a teaser for what's to come next week. But before we get into the Apple event, let's start off with our trivia question for the week, which is USB 1.0 was released in 1996. What was the maximum transfer speed of USB 1.0? So what was the maximum transfer speed of USB 1.0? And that is your trivia question for the week. And with that out of the way, let's get into the Apple event, specifically the iPhone event. Now, they did spend a surprisingly decent amount of the event talking about their various environmental impact stuff, and you can take that as you will. Some people think it's greenwashing. Some people think it's awesome, all the stuff they're doing. You can take it at what you will. But I was kind of surprised how much they spent talking about it. Like, they had an entire, mock-up, cinematic, not necessarily cinematic, but, almost, play-esque, acting thing of them with their environmental stuff, which I don't think they've ever done that before. Usually they'll have a blurb about what they're doing to be carbon neutral, or how they're doing X, Y, and Z to be better for the environment, or whatever. But this was definitely new that I hadn't seen them do before. So that was one thing that was a little interesting. But actually getting into some of the new hardware and such, kind of as the rumors, as we kind of talked about last week, for the most part, generally panned out to be fairly accurate, I'd say. So starting off with AirPods, there wasn't really any new update per se to AirPods specifically, but the AirPods case now comes with USB-C. That's going to be a recurring theme this episode, and for the event, USB-C was a recurring theme. One thing that was pretty cool, spoiler alert about the iPhones, they also got USB-C, but the reason I bring that up is because there's also a feature where it's not the reverse wireless charging of some tech enthusiast's dreams, but what you can do is you'll be able to plug in a USB-C cable into your iPhone and then plug the other end into your AirPods case, and you'll be able to charge your AirPods case and subsequently your AirPods through the battery on your phone, which is pretty cool. Now, I know Android phones have had the ability to reverse wireless charge devices for a little while now, so all the Android people are probably laughing that the iPhone can only do it through a cable. But got to take the baby steps, right? You got to start somewhere. So the next thing, which I don't know if it's, I think once we actually get into it, it probably won't be that much of a surprise. But one thing about the event that has been kind of glossed over, if it's been even talked about at all, about the event, was the new Apple Watch. And I think, as we'll see, it's probably not a surprise compared to the major updates that the iPhone got. The Apple Watch was fairly minor in comparison, which is kind of what the rumors were suggesting, that it wasn't going to be a huge update, mainly just a minor spec bump. But with the spec bump, though, while it does have basically the same design as the past few years, and subsequently the Apple Watch Ultra 2, I believe is what they're calling it, is also, again, basically exactly the same. Which I guess on the one hand, if you recently spent the $800 for the baseline Apple Watch Ultra, you'd probably be a little annoyed if there was a massive update to it the following year, and maybe you would feel inclined to drop another $800. But anyway, pretty minor updates all around. Aesthetically, they're pretty much the same as the previous year. But the big update for the new Apple Watches is the new chip upgrade that they got. So according to Apple, the transistor count is 60% higher than the previous chip, probably in large part due to a processor shrink. I don't necessarily think they went to 3 nanometer, but probably maybe dropped down to 5 nanometer or something. But apparently this was I believe the first chip upgrade in a few years, at least major chip upgrade, aside from maybe some small minor changes. So that is something you'll notice. And with the chip upgrade, there's improvements to the neural engine to take advantage of even more machine learning tasks on the Apple Watch itself. And Apple claims it'll give up to a 2 times performance boost to on-device Siri processing. So anyone that uses Siri a lot on their Apple Watch will probably be happy to hear that. They also claim that dictation is also 25% more accurate with the new chip on the Apple Watch, which could be pretty helpful if you do a lot of text or speak to text type thing to reply to messages or what have you. That could potentially be pretty beneficial. And another pretty big upgrade for the new Apple Watch, which I think is specific to this new one. I don't necessarily think it's coming to the older ones, but it might, is Siri finally getting access to health data. So I guess the thought here is with the added performance boost to the on-device machine learning processing, as Apple quoted, 2 times the performance increase. That extra performance allows them to actually handle all of the processing that they would want to do with health data without having to reach out to the Apple servers to, get the response that Siri's supposed to reply with. So all that data can be done, all that processing rather can be done on device. So all of your sensitive health data isn't going out to the scary, spooky cloud, because obviously that's probably the last place that you want your data, or your health data specifically, to be going. Now, aside from the chip upgrade, probably the other biggest feature, which again is only coming to the new version of the Apple Watch, so the Series 9 and the Ultra 2, is this feature that they're calling Double Tap, which kind of takes inspiration from the Vision Pro headset that we saw at WWDC back in June. So the idea here is you can do minor gestures with like your hand, and the Apple Watch is supposed to be able to detect that and handle the gesture accordingly. So apparently how it's supposed to work is it's supposed to like monitor like minor changes in like your wrist movement and like blood flow in order to register various actions that you did. So like, for example, double tapping your like index finger and thumb together is one of them. Some other things is like making a fist, kind of like closing your hand into a fist is one. Flicking your finger is another one. So how they did that, probably with the benefit of all the extra machine learning performance from the new chip upgrade, is probably how they're able to pull it off and why it won't be coming to older versions of the Apple Watch. But as far as things you can do with this new gesture double tap thing, is you can do things like answer calls, play pause music, stop a timer, and if you're on the home screen of the Apple Watch, you can do this to like bring up the new widgets menu that'll be coming to watchOS 10. Now, one thing to note about the double tap gesture is it won't be available at launch. Presumably, it'll be coming in an update sometime in October. So if you are planning on getting the new Apple Watch, that's something to keep in mind, that this double tap feature is not going to be accessible right at launch. Another update to the Series 9 over the Series 8 is Apple's claiming it is 2 times brighter compared to the Series 8. So that is a nice plus there, especially if you use your Apple Watch outside frequently. Might be a little bit easier to see it. And another fairly decent upgrade that it got Apple's new second generation ultra wideband chip. I guess they didn't have the courage to call it the U2 chip. I guess maybe they have bad memories of U2 and that one U2 album was like pretty much given away for free with like iTunes like back in the day, if anyone remembers that. I don't know, but they're calling it the second generation ultra wideband chip, so it makes it easier to find devices with the Find My app. And this is also something that's coming to the new iPhones as well. And then so that's the Series 9. The Ultra 2, really not much here. I mean, it gets the same kind of updates that we talked about for the Series 9. And then it also has a brighter screen compared to the previous model. And it also has an improved altimeter as well. And that's basically it. So pretty minor updates to the Ultra 2, specifically over the Ultra 1. I mean, obviously it has all the stuff that we talked about with the Series 9. But as far as pricing goes, the starting price for the Series 9 comes in at $399, and the starting price for the Ultra 2 comes in at $799. I believe they're available for pre-order now, and they will be available arriving starting on September 22nd. So we talked about the ultra wideband chip the second generation ultra wideband chip in the new Apple Watches, and it's also coming to the iPhones too. So specifically what the ultra wideband chip, the second generation, the improvements it brings is updated to 3 times greater find distance. So which could be beneficial. So one of the demos that Apple showed off was being able to find your friend's location, be able to find your friend once GPS is no longer useful, because while GPS is great for getting like the general location of where something or someone is, once you get really granular, it can't help you that much. So this is where the Find My can kick in and help you locate your friend. I would assume they would have to be sharing their location with you, because otherwise that would be a little creepy in my opinion, but I guess to each their own. But that's the new ultra wideband chip that's coming to both the Apple Watches and the new iPhones. So speaking of the new iPhones, they're getting an update to the SOS mode, the satellite feature, which I believe is also coming to the 14 models as well, since they also have the satellite feature. And this specific new satellite feature is for roadside assistance. So if you ever get stranded on the side of the road and you don't have cell service, Apple partnered with AAA to allow that is another option in the SOS satellite feature. So probably the most depressing news out of the entire iPhone event here is for all of the iPhone mini lovers out there. So we talked last week, kind of going over some of the rumors that I was kind of giving hope, and I was trying to hold out hope that, the iPhone mini might make a return. And I was saying that they still sell the iPhone 12 now, and the iPhone 13 is also still being sold, and the 13 mini is also being sold. So I was thinking that the iPhone 13 and 13 mini would also still be sold once the new phones come out. But alas, the iPhone 13 mini is killed. It is no longer available on Apple's website, at least new. So that is a big rip for all of the mini lovers out there. So unless something happens next year, it looks like the mini is dead, which I think is kind of sad. I think I've heard some talk about when it comes to the mini phones that people that like the small phone are very loud vocal minority, which I guess could add credence to why Apple killed it off because it didn't sell well. And while people that like the mini phones are really enthusiastic about it, that doesn't necessarily translate to the general public that just want larger and larger phones. I guess that can also be seen with the whole foldable phone craze that's been kind of taking off for the past few years. Although I think for most people, a foldable phone is a little outside the price range because aside from a couple of the flip phones that kind of resemble old school flip phones, aside from those, pretty much all the ones that fold are close to $2,000, which in fairness to them, if you fully spec out like an iPhone Pro Max, you can get close to that number as well. But for most people, that's a little outside of their price range, I think, for a phone. But anyway, getting back on topic, so starting off with the base iPhone 15. So this year's iPhone 15 is basically following the trend that the iPhone 14 set last year of basically being the previous year's Pro phone with some caveats. So like last year, the iPhone 14, the base model, was essentially the same thing as the iPhone 13 Pro, aside from like ProMotion and the telephoto lens. Similarly, this year, the iPhone 15 is basically the same thing as the iPhone 14 Pro, so it does get the dynamic island, so that might be cool if people are into the dynamic island. You get the dynamic island. You get the A16 chip, which was in the iPhone 14 Pro. You get the 48 megapixel camera that the iPhone 14 Pro had. But again, the big difference is being that you don't get ProMotion, which is the high refresh screen, and you also don't get the always-on display that the iPhone 14 Pro had. I mean, personally for me, that wouldn't be an issue at all because I wouldn't use the always-on display anyway for the sake of battery life purposes, but that's just my personal preference. But when it comes to the camera, like I said, it gets the same 48 megapixel camera as the 14 Pro, so this will allow you to get a 2x zoom, whereas now you don't get any optical zoom. So the zoom you get is basically cropping in on the 48 megapixel camera to get just a 12 megapixel image. So that's basically how the zooming feature will work. But one thing that's really cool about both the iPhone 15 and the 15 Pro cameras is if the camera detects a subject in the photo, it will capture all of the portrait mode data for you. So then later, after the fact, if you want to turn it into a portrait mode photo, you can do that if you want to, which is a pretty cool feature that they add that in. And another thing you can also do with this extra focus mode, or the portrait mode stuff being kind of baked in to the photo itself, is after you've already taken the photo, you can change the focus of the photo after the fact, which is pretty cool. Now we get to the feature that everyone, I think, has been talking about, which is USB-C coming to the iPhone 15. Now, there was some speculation that maybe the 15 would stay Lightning for this year and then next year get USB-C, but no, all of the iPhone 15 phones get USB-C. But the iPhone 15, the base model, got absolutely kneecapped with USB-C because it is capped out at a top speed of USB 2. So it's basically the exact same transfer speeds as Lightning, just with a different connector. So it's basically Lightning, but a different connector. That's pretty much it. Which is, if you're unaware, USB 2 tops out at a theoretical maximum transfer speed of 480 megabits per second. Needless to say, I know people with faster internet speeds from their ISP than that. Unfortunately, I am not one of those people. I get fairly close. I mean, I probably could. I definitely could be one of those people if I wasn't such a cheapskate and didn't want to pay a ton of money for internet. But in fairness, this does line up with what the rumors were saying, that the iPhone 15 would just get USB 2 or not get like as fast of speed as the Pro model. But nonetheless, it is kind of sad to see because a little bit of USB history here for you. USB 2 came out in 2001, so well over 20 years ago that this standard that Apple put in their new phone came out. And granted, USB 3, which is a faster variant of USB, came out in 2008, which is still like 15 years ago, and they couldn't even bother putting that in the base 15. So that is kind of sad to see, which, kind of going back to the internet speed thing, like we live in a time where obviously depends on where you live, but if you live in the places like where Apple is headquartered, like in the California Bay Area, I think it's pretty easy to get internet speeds from an ISP that are faster than the transfer speeds you would get from your phone. So in a really odd twist, it potentially could be faster for you to upload your photos to either maybe you have a NAS or something, or to like cloud storage or something, and then download them that way. And that potentially could be faster than just trying to transfer them off the phone. Maybe. I don't know. I'm just kind of throwing out ideas here. But going back to the transfer speed, obviously the internal storage on these new phones is way, 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 way faster than 480 megabits per second. That is definitely for sure. Now, as far as the pricing goes, the pricing is unchanged compared to last year. So you're still starting with the base iPhone 15 at $799 and the iPhone 15 Plus starting at $899. So moving into the iPhone 15 Pro line, this is where some more of the big updates come, and the iPhone 15 Pro line kind of starts to pull away, I guess, in a way from the base iPhone 15. So the probably one of the biggest features, aside from the USB-C, is the new titanium frame that surrounds the iPhone 15 Pro. So compared to the prior generation, the 14 Pro and the 13 Pro, that had stainless steel borders, and probably even going back further than that, having stainless steel borders, the iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max now have titanium borders surrounding the phone. So all of you out there that like to live dangerously and not use a case on your phone, or those people out there that just get a new phone every year so they really don't care what happens to their phone, so they don't use a case, for those people, you don't have to necessarily worry about the sides of your phone getting all smudged up and disgusting looking with fingerprints, because let me tell you, the stainless steel rails on the previous generation Pro lines of phones are absolute fingerprint magnets if you don't have a case on them or wearing gloves or something. But the titanium should definitely help with that, so it should look nicer after some use. And also, because they switched over to titanium, the phone is now 9% lighter as a result. So it had kind of been a trend the past few years where the Pro phones kept getting heavier and heavier, with obviously the stainless steel border frame around them, and also the bigger and bigger batteries that they were trying to cram in there. But with the titanium being obviously lighter than stainless steel, that is a reduction in weight. And they also did some kind of like mad science chemistry thing too, where they like have the titanium frame, but then like the inner part of the phone itself is like made of aluminum, and they did some kind of like bonding thing that doesn't use screws or anything. It was kind of crazy. I'm not a chemist person or material science person, so I'm not entirely sure how all that worked. But according to Apple, the point of this was to improve repairability of the phone. And now if you're aware about Apple products in recent years, repairability is not necessarily one of the biggest selling points or strong features of Apple products. But that's what they said was part of the reason for the new housing and whatnot, was to allow the back to come off easier for better repairability. Now, another big feature that came to the 15 Pro line was the action button. So this is something that had been rumored for a while, and it indeed has come to fruition. It replaces the mute switch on the side of the phone. Now, for anyone that likes the mute switch, don't worry. By default, the action button is mapped to the mute switch, but you can also do a bunch of other things with the action button as well. And some of the things that you can do is open the camera, turn on the flashlight, turn on Do Not Disturb or some other focus mode. You can go open the Translate app. You can record a voice memo. You can do various accessibility settings, like toggle the magnifier. So this could be an excellent solution for anyone out there who maybe forgets their reading glasses and they need to access the magnifier quickly. They can just tap the action button and get the magnifier there to help them out. And probably one of the biggest things that the action button can do is Siri shortcuts. So if you're pretty snazzy with your Siri shortcuts, you can basically make the action button do anything you want, which is pretty cool that they gave you that much customization, since some people like to say that Apple isn't necessarily known for giving their users a bunch of customization. It's pretty much they kind of decide what's best for you, with some minor caveats in there. One of the biggest points to credit this is the fact that while you can now add widgets and whatnot to your lock screen or to your home screen, you can't move apps anywhere you want. So if you wanted, say, 4 apps on the very top row and then 1 app at the very bottom, they don't let you do that. Whereas on Android, for example, you can do that to your heart's content. But anyway, that was the action button's pretty cool. Pretty cool that they're allowing you to use Siri shortcuts. And the interface that they showed for configuring the action button was very interesting. It didn't necessarily look like iOS, but nonetheless, at least to me, it looked pretty darn cool. But another thing with the action button that is maybe a little odd is the fact that it appears that it only has single press support. So you can't like map a double tap for the action button to do one thing, and then a single press to do something else, and then maybe holding it down can do another action or something like that. It's just one action for everything. Potentially, I mean, I guess it's possible that in future software updates they could add support for additional things like double presses or long presses or something like that. But at least as of right now, it does not support that. So now I guess we can talk about the USB-C feature coming to the iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max. So it's better than the iPhone 15, but not necessarily by a whole lot. So some of the rumors were speculating that maybe it's going to get Thunderbolt. It did not. It only got USB 3, specifically based on the numbers that they were claiming, USB 3.1. And the reason why I say that is USB 3.0 has a theoretical maximum transfer speed of 5 gigabits per second, but Apple quotes a maximum transfer speed with an appropriate cable, which allegedly is not the cable that comes in the box, so you'd have to have a separate one, apparently. But anyway, that's besides the point. They claim that with the correct cable, you can get up to 10 gigabits per second, which is USB 3.1 speeds. So kind of wish that they would have had faster, because I mean, I believe the iPad Pros, I believe they have Thunderbolt capability, so why they couldn't bring that to the iPhone, I'm not entirely sure. But one thing that you gotta love is the marketing propaganda that Apple pushed about the USB transfer speed. They boast a 20 times faster transfer speeds, which, I mean, yeah, you go from like 480 megabits per second to 10 gigabits per second. I mean, yeah, it's impressive, but like it's not necessarily anything to write home about, which I guess is why they went with that number and left the 10 gigabits per second to the fine print at the bottom of the page for the website. Now, granted, don't make it sound like I'm mad that it only has USB 3.1 speeds. Like, obviously, that's a good thing, and the iPhone has been in some serious need of some faster transfer speeds off of it, especially with how massive, you know, these video files that Apple's allowing you to record with, you know, like the 4K Pro RAW and all this other stuff coming to the Pro lines of phones. So it is definitely a welcome change for sure. But it would have been nicer if they would have, you know, actually used a technology from this decade or closer to this decade rather than from 2013, which, yes, the title of this podcast episode was not a typo. I did not mean to say welcome to 2023. I did actually mean to say 2013, specifically for this reason, because USB 3.1 came out in 2013. So little bit, for those of you that made it this far in the episode, now you know where the title comes from, and it's not me fat fingering the number. But anyway, the next big upgrade coming to the iPhone 15 Pro line is the new chip. Now, they did a little something different with the chip this year and called it the A17 Pro, which is the first time in the A series of chips that they've gone with a Pro name. Previously, it was the Bionic, was what they were calling the chips. So the interesting thing about the A17 Pro chip is it has a dedicated USB 3 controller on board, which has led some speculation that this is the reason why it's called Pro, and theoretically next year, when the iPhone 16 gets the A17 chip, it won't get the A17 Pro, but instead will maybe get like a base A17 chip that won't have the USB 3 controller on board and still get stuck with USB 2 speeds. So that is some speculation. I'm not sure I don't think there's any credibility one way or the other to that, but at the same time, it wouldn't necessarily surprise me, since Apple likes to differentiate their Pro line from their regular line. So I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if that's something that they end up doing. Would it be disappointing? Absolutely. But I can't say I'd be surprised if that's something that they end up going with. But I guess we'll see in about a year's time. Now, obviously, the other big upgrade, as the rumors suggested, is the A17 is now a 3-nanometer process. So like we mentioned last week, that basically means 3 nanometers is the size between the transistors, meaning that you can cram more transistors into the same space, and due to that, you can have faster speeds and better efficiency for the same, number of transistors and whatnot. So Apple is claiming on their 2 high-performance cores. So as a quick recap, the iPhone 8 or the A17 Pro chip comes with 2 high-performance cores and 4 efficiency cores. The 2 high-performance cores are up 10% in performance according to Apple's numbers compared to the A16, and the 4 efficiency cores are, quote, also faster according to Apple. They didn't give any kind of numbers whatsoever. They did give like a very ambiguous number saying it's like 3 times more efficient than the competitor or something. Who they were comparing against, I am not entirely sure. They didn't say, but that it is what it is. Obviously, with the smaller process size, it is going to be more efficient. But some of the bigger improvements to the chip, and where I think they really moved the transistors to, like adding the transistors, the additional transistors, was to the neural engine and the GPU specifically. So the neural engine is 16 cores, and according to Apple, boasts is 2 times faster compared to the A16, according to Apple. So that's a lot of extra machine learning and AI horsepower for sure right there. And also the GPU, again, according to Apple, is 20% faster compared to the A16, probably in large part to it gaining an extra GPU core. But probably one of the most notable changes to the GPU, aside from it getting an additional core, is the fact that it now has hardware ray tracing. So you now have hardware ray tracing on an iPhone. So if you're not familiar with ray tracing, it's basically a way to render graphics a lot more realistically and more dynamically on the fly. NVIDIA is going to be laughing because they've had hardware ray tracing since their 2000 series, 20 series, whatever they're calling it, the 2080, 2070, those GPUs when they released the RTX line of graphics cards. So it's been a few years, so ray tracing isn't necessarily something new. But it is cool to see that it's coming to the iPhone. But the thing that I think is really cool is if they're able to have hardware ray tracing on an iPhone chip that is obviously a lot more limited than a desktop or laptop chip like you would have in the M series of chips that would be in the various Macs, we could see some pretty impressive capabilities coming to the Mac, specifically this year with the M3 line, since the M3 is presumably going to be based off the A17 process and architecture and whatnot. So theoretically, the hardware ray tracing would be included as a feature in the new M3 series chips. So being able to see what that could bring as once you scale it up more to, Mac chips, that will be something I think that'll be pretty impressive to watch and see. And especially going on into future generations as they improve their ray tracing capability on these chips. But another thing that was really cool was they said that console AAA games such as Resident Evil Village, Resident Evil 4, Death Stranding, and Assassin's Creed Mirage will be coming to the iPhone 15 Pro and be playable with ray tracing. I mean, just think about that. AAA console games being playable on an iPhone. Now, granted, I'm not sure what kind of graphical settings that's going to be. It's probably not going to be 4K or anything like that. I mean, obviously the screen wouldn't be able to display that at the full resolution anyway, but I think the big thing that people are kind of gathering from this is if you can have these native AAA games be playable on the iPhone, that also means they're natively playable on the Macs too, because since the transition over to Apple Silicon, any iOS app is by default natively compatible with Mac OS, meaning that if a AAA game is playable on an iPhone, it will theoretically anyway be playable on the Mac as well. So it, again, adding credence to it, will be very interesting to see what happens with the new M3 chips, which should be coming end of this year and into next year. So that'll be definitely something to keep an eye on. Now, the iPhone 15 Pro cameras, as usual, get a pretty decent upgrade. Apple likes to talk about their cameras. So in addition to the same portrait mode features that came to the base iPhone 15, the iPhone 15 Pro cameras now allow you to record spatial video for the Vision Pro, but that's not going to be available at launch. That'll be coming in a future update. But the big pro here is now you don't have to be the creepy dude at the party wearing the massive honkin' Vision Pro on your head recording people like that they showed that guy in the one demo to quote unquote relive the moment. So now you can actually just be a normal person and record it with your phone and then be able to relive the moment later, which I think is a pretty awesome and welcome change that's coming to the iPhone. Now, it's unclear if this is specifically only on the Pro line or if this is also coming to other older Pro series phones. It wouldn't surprise me if they make this just exclusive to the 15 Pro. But one big difference between the 15 Pro and the 15 Pro Max is the 15 Pro Max now gets a 5x telephoto lens. So the base iPhone 15 Pro is still going to be stuck with the 3x zoom lens, which has been on for the past couple years now. But the Pro Max now gets a 5x lens, which another differentiator between it and the regular Pro model, which I don't think has happened since, I want to say either the iPhone 11 or the iPhone 12. I can't remember which, but one of those phones, the Pro was a little bit different than the Pro Max because of like a minor camera feature. So this is kind of going back to that, trying to make the Pro and the Pro Max different from each other. So as far as how the 5X works, so basically it does this by folding and refracting the light through a prism rather than a typical periscope system like other phones have. Now, how specifically does that work? I'm not super sure because I'm not a physics major. So ask a physics major who knows stuff about optics, and they might be able to answer your question, since I'm just a code monkey who occasionally breaks stuff in my home lab, not a physics person per se. So I'm not entirely sure, but that's basically the general gist. Is they have the light refracting off a prism rather than a periscope style lens, which is how more of a lot of the other Android phones do their zoom features. Another thing coming to the Pro Max specifically is the sensor shift. So on the previous phones, all the phones in the Pro line have had a sensor shift to do stabilization on the X and Y plane, but now the Pro Max also will have stabilization on the Z axis, so front and back as well for improved autofocus. And another feature coming to both the Pro and the Pro Max is you now have the ability to set custom focal lengths for your default zoom preference. So rather than just having 1x zoom, you could select between the default being 1x or 1.2x or 1.5x. You can do that in the settings to, if you like a certain focal length on your photos as your default, you can go into the settings and set that. And one really cool thing, which I guess is partially enabled with the USB 3 functionality, is you can connect external storage to the USB-C port and record videos from your iPhone directly to that external storage, which is honestly pretty incredible. It makes the whole offloading the video process even easier, because theoretically you don't even have to offload it anymore because it's already on an external storage medium. So you can just plug that into your computer and start going to town with your editing. So that is definitely something that I think will be very useful amongst the pros out there that like to record a bunch of stuff with their phones, because even still having to record that and then offload it later, if you can just immediately offload it to whatever medium you want to have it saved on, that could be beneficial. Again, I guess one caveat to that would be you'd potentially have something hanging off your phone. So unless you had some kind of like mount or a long cable that you could stick the drive or whatever in a pocket or something, might not necessarily be all that practical, but definitely something pretty cool nonetheless. Now, as far as pricing is concerned, the iPhone 15 Pro is unchanged, starts at $999, and that comes with 128 gigs of storage like the previous generations. But the Pro Max does get a price increase of $100 up to $1,199, but as a little bonus, Apple decided to throw you a bone here and bump up your storage from 128 to 256 gigs. So while you are paying an additional $100 over compared to last year, you do get an additional 128 gigs of storage, and you also get that additional camera feature with the 5x telephoto lens and the additional stabilization feature. So I guess that is their way to justify the $100 price increase. But yeah, that is one thing to keep in mind. The Pro Max does get a price increase, which in fairness, the rumors were kind of suggesting that both of the Pro phones would be going up by $100, but I guess Apple decided to only increase the base Pro model only increase the base not the base. They kept the base Pro model the same and only increased the Pro Max by $100. So as far as when you can order them, you can order them now, and they will be arriving on September 22nd, just like the Apple Watches. So that was basically the event. Overall, I guess, as you could say, like year over year, generally kind of minor updates. But again, if you're someone like me, and I think a lot of you out there that hold on to your technology for a while and don't upgrade every single year, definitely some good upgrades, especially when you consider all the upgrades from previous generations of phones and watches that you would get wrapped into these additional ones that you're getting. Specifically, I think the Pro line for the iPhones was definitely kind of a standout. Definitely got a lot of, surprisingly, a fair amount of new features. When you think about the new titanium frame and the improved camera features, I guess most of those camera features are coming with the Pro Max. But the improvements to the chip with the A17 Pro and the 3nm process, the efficiency gains you're going to get from that, the performance gains you're going to get from that, which, in all honesty, if you're using any iPhone that came out in like the past 5 years, you probably aren't going to really notice the performance difference on a day-to-day basis anyway, but it is nice to have, especially when you factor in the additional efficiency that you're going to get with the newer chip. Definitely cool to see all of the GPU features with the hardware ray tracing. That's something that I think is pretty cool, and I'm really interested to see where Apple takes that. And again, the other thing that Apple's been really trying to hammer home this past year, like everyone else in the AI race, is improving their machine learning and artificial intelligence capabilities, and adding even more processing for hardware, to be able to do that, the neural engine capabilities, to have hardware specifically to handle those machine learning type tasks to hopefully improve Siri, since Siri has been sort of stagnant for the past few years, and there's been even jokes circling around that Siri, the code base for Siri is literally just one gigantic switch statement, which I find pretty hilarious. Now, for those of you who aren't software developers, basically what a switch statement is kind of like an if statement, but rather than checking specifically for true false values, you're checking for cases. So specifically, if you think of things like enumerations or enums, where you could have like an enum for, in this case, we're talking about iPhones, right? You could have an enum for the various brands of iPhones. So you could have an enum called iPhones, and it would have the values iPhone 15, iPhone 15 Plus, iPhone 15 Pro, and iPhone 15 Pro Max. And then you'd have your switch statement that would switch on some variable that is an iPhone enum, and then your first case would be if it is the iPhone 15, your second case would be if it's the iPhone 15 Plus, third case Pro, and then Pro Max. And then you'd have a default case where for some reason you got something that wasn't one of those four values, you could handle that accordingly. So that is kind of the joke, that Siri is just one gigantic switch statement handling a bunch of various different cases, which with some of Siri's responses, there is a little bit of credence to that. If you really dig deep into it, like specifically, like if it can't find anything, take what the user asked and say, "This is what I found on the web." Probably one of the biggest ones for that, because if it's not something like super simple, Siri kind of just defaults to "This is what I found on the web." But anyway, we're kind of getting a little bit off topic. We're supposed to, talk about the Apple event, and here I am talking about programming and switch statements. But Yeah, that was the event. As far as we talked about a lot about the iPhones, ultra wideband chip. I think that's pretty cool too. Cool to see the improved finding distance and finding range for that. That's cool to see. And then also, I think while the Apple Watch, I personally I don't own an Apple Watch, but while the updates seem kind of minor, I think the upgrades to the chip is probably the biggest update, because I mean the double tap gesture is pretty nice and kind of cool, but as far as like practical usage, I'm not necessarily entirely sure how useful it's going to be from a practical standpoint. As I heard, I think it was on 9 to 5 Mac Daily. I think they did like a kind of a recap thing, and I think one of the comments they made was like, yeah, you can do the double tap, with your fingertips, or you could just be like a normal person and like use your nose, like if your alarm's going off, and your hands aren't free, you just tap the stop button or whatever with your nose, kind of a thing, which I thought was kind of funny. But yeah, again, going back to the new chip, having even more transistors to improve performance, and again that improved neural engine for on-device Siri processing and access to health data, pretty cool. So overall, I guess you could say it was kind of minor updates all around, but also at the same time, some of them were kind of bigger and impressive. And especially if you're not coming from last year's device, like if you're not coming from an iPhone 14 or 14 Pro, or you're not coming from an Apple Watch Series 8, definitely some decent updates here when you factor in, all the previous updates that you're going to be getting. So specifically, like if you're still hanging around with like an iPhone 10 or 10s or 11 or something like that, this potentially, upgrading to like the 15 or 15 Pro would definitely be a pretty big upgrade for you. And then as far as the Apple Watch goes, if you're anything older than the 6, which was I think the last major redesign, it probably would be a decent upgrade for you. If you're rocking something newer on the Apple Watch line, like the 6, 7, or 8, might not be as big of an upgrade, but again, with the new chip, and maybe if those the double tap gestures and the improved Siri intelligence is appealing to you, maybe potentially worth upgrading. But yeah, that's pretty much the iPhone event and my thoughts on it. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode, but before we go, we have to get back to our trivia question. So USB was obviously kind of a focal point of the Apple event, with USB-C been dominating the headlines with Apple switching to USB-C, but starting it all with USB 1.0 that was released in 1996. What was the maximum transfer speed of USB 1.0? Now, I will take two answers for this because there's kind of sort of two answers. The first one is the low-speed variant and the high-speed variant. So the low-speed variant was 1.5 megabits per second, and the high speed or the full speed variant was 12 megabits per second. So I guess in fairness to Apple, with their base USB 2 speeds, 480 megabits per second is a heck of a lot faster than 12 or 1.5. So I guess in that sense, you can give them some props there. So that's going to be it for this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, I ask that you leave it a rating and review and subscribe to the Darkest Athens podcast if you haven't done so already. And be sure to tune in to next week's episode, because we got a ton of nerdy stuff to cover, seeing that we didn't cover any this week. We're going to have a double helping of it next week, so you'll definitely want to stay tuned for that. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, some infrastructure upgrades, and me living up to my name I gave myself of a code monkey who occasionally breaks stuff in my home lab, because boy oh boy did I break stuff. I did eventually get it fixed, but I also did break stuff. But if you have any questions about this episode or topics or comments or ideas for future episodes, you can send me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. There's a link for that down in the show notes below. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.